Los Angeles, early 1961. A private lunch in a Beverly Hills home where decisions are never written down, only remembered. Around the table sit men and women who shape careers with a nod, a pause, a silence held too long. Silverware catches the light. Laughter moves carefully, measuring who is safe to agree with. Marilyn Monroe sits slightly apart. Her smile arrives on time, maybe a second too late. Someone offers a remark that pretends to be clever, a joke that doesn't bruise the speaker, only the subject. The table laughs. Not everyone. Elvis Presley says nothing. He doesn't look at the man who spoke. He looks at Marilyn, at the effort it takes to remain composed when the room has already chosen its comfort over decency. In that quiet second, something shifts. Because Elvis is about to do what no one here expects, not by raising his voice, not by defending anyone outright, and not by breaking a single social rule. He is about to ruin the atmosphere so completely that no one at that table will ever laugh the same way again. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The dinner took place far from flashbulbs and studio gates, in a quiet Spanish-style house tucked into the hills above Sunset Boulevard. The kind of place where success was assumed and discussed only in subtext. Heavy wooden doors, low ceilings, a long table polished to a dull sheen. Candles burned, not for romance, but for atmosphere, controlled, tasteful, expensive. People arrived already performing. A screenwriter with tired eyes, 2 actors whose names had recently slipped down the call sheets, a producer who laughed too loudly at his own remarks, and then Marilyn Monroe, a few minutes late, as expected. Not dramatically late, just enough for several people to notice, to exchange looks that carried more meaning than words. She apologized softly, touched the back of her chair before sitting, as if grounding herself. Her dress was simple for her standards, pale, almost fragile against the darker tones of the room. She placed her clutch on the floor, folded her hands, waited. Elvis Presley sat across the table, angled slightly away from her. He'd spoken little since arriving, not withdrawn, simply observant. His jacket hung loose on his shoulders, collar open. He listened the way some men watch poker tables, not the cards, but the faces. The conversation began where these conversations always did. Projects, schedules, who was attached to what? Careers measured in future tense. Then, the star, the man with the confident smile and the reputation for knowing exactly where power flowed, leaned back, glass in hand. "Well," he said lightly, eyes drifting toward Marilyn without fully meeting hers, "at least punctuality isn't the only thing Hollywood demands from its darlings. It's kinder when it lets you know when the clock is running out." The sentence landed softly. That was the cruelty of it. No raised voice, no insult you could quote later. Just implication, sharpened enough to cut. A few people laughed, quickly, almost too quickly. The kind of laughter that served as insurance. Marilyn did not react at first. She reached for her water instead, took a small sip, set the glass down with care. When she finally smiled, it came a fraction of a second too late, as if she'd found it somewhere behind herself and pulled it forward by force. Her eyes stayed on the table. Elvis noticed how her shoulders tightened, then settled again, as though she'd practiced that movement. He noticed how no one contradicted the remark, how silence became agreement when fear filled the gaps. He said nothing. That absence began to weigh on the room. Someone shifted in their seat. The producer cleared his throat and redirected the conversation, but the current had already changed. Another comment followed, quieter, sharper, aimed to impress. "Of course," the star added almost kindly, "some people burn brightest right before they fade." This time, no one laughed immediately. Elvis still didn't move. He didn't look at Marilyn. He didn't look at the man who'd spoken. He simply listened, letting the words settle, letting the room reveal itself. And somewhere between the clink of silverware and the breath held too long, it became clear to everyone at the table. This dinner was no longer polite. It had chosen its target. The conversation drifted the way it always did after the first glass of wine, away from films and toward survival. Contracts became stories, stories became warnings. Who had been renewed? Who hadn't? Who was suddenly difficult? The table leaned into relevance like men listening for thunder. The star adjusted his cufflinks, a casual gesture meant to signal ease. He spoke again, this time more openly, as if the room had already given him permission. "It's strange," he said, nodding toward no one in particular, "how the town stops waiting. Talent doesn't disappear. Time just decides it's no longer patient." His eyes found Marilyn now, direct, assessing. The tone was warm enough to pass as concern. "Marilyn, you've given them so much," he continued. "It's almost unfair how little Hollywood gives back when it decides to move on." The word "when" hung in the air, not "if." She inhaled as if preparing for a line, then paused. Her fingers tightened together. When she spoke, it came softly, unevenly. I don't think it's about time," she began, searching for footing. "Sometimes it's about what they let you do." A few nods, polite, empty. She tried again, her voice losing confidence mid-sentence. The thought unraveled before it could land. She stopped speaking altogether. The silence that followed was worse than laughter, exposed, unforgiving. Someone reached for their glass. Someone else stared too intently at their plate. Elvis set his fork down. The sound was small but final. He didn't look at the man who'd spoken. Instead, he turned slightly toward the host, his expression neutral. "By the way," Elvis said calmly, "did that writer from New York ever sign with you? The one everyone was circling last spring?" The question seemed misplaced. The host blinked, caught off guard, then shook his head. "No." Studio passed. Elvis nodded once, as if confirming something only he had been tracking. "Funny," he said, still mild. "How fast interest dries up when a story stops being convenient." The room waited. No one was sure what they were waiting for. An argument, a joke, a shift back to safety. It didn't come. Marilyn stared at her hands, then up at Elvis, uncertain. He gave her no reassurance, no glance meant to comfort. Only composure, control. The star smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. For the first time that evening, the room understood. The table was no longer his alone to command. No one addressed the pause directly. That was the rule in rooms like this. Discomfort was ignored until it dissolved or turned into something useful. Glasses were lifted. Someone murmured about a location shoot in Arizona. The table tried to resume its rhythm, but the tempo had changed. Elvis didn't reclaim the conversation. He let it breathe. Then, without raising his voice or shifting his posture, he spoke again, not to the man who had been circling Marilyn all night, but to the room itself. "You know," he said, almost thoughtfully, "there aren't many people in this town who argue with studios and still get hired again." A few heads turned. This wasn't a punchline. "Most don't," Elvis continued. "They're told what to play, how to sound, where to stand, and they say yes, because saying no costs money." His eyes finally moved, not sharply, not accusingly, and rested on Marilyn. "But every once in a while," he said, "someone decides they'd rather be difficult than disposable." The word landed differently than the others that night. It wasn't sharp. It wasn't wrapped in irony. Marilyn looked up, startled, not flattered, recognized. No one had framed it that way before. Elvis didn't mention beauty, didn't say talent the way men said it when they meant something else. He spoke of meetings delayed, of scripts refused, of walking away from roles that would have paid well and erased her quietly. Facts known only to people who paid attention. Across the table, the star shifted in his chair. Elvis turned slightly now, just enough. "I remember a picture," he added, voice steady. "There was supposed to be prestige. Big director, serious tone. Everyone wanted in. A pause, calculated, not theatrical. "Didn't end up casting the loudest name in the room," Elvis said. "Went with someone who didn't need to remind them why he mattered." The table froze. No names were spoken. None were needed. A fork stopped halfway to a mouth. A laugh died before forming. The star's smile hardened, held in place by pride alone. He said nothing, not because he had nothing to say, but because responding would confirm what everyone had just understood. The air changed. It wasn't hostile. It was alert. Marilyn felt it first, the strange relief of no longer being the center, not because she'd vanished, but because someone else had shifted the weight. She met Elvis's gaze, not with gratitude, with something quieter, something steadier. Then a voice from the far end of the table cut in, too casually. "Well," someone said, attempting lightness, "I suppose courage looks different when you're already untouchable." The sentence hovered, half observation, half challenge, and this time, no one pretended it was harmless. The meal continued in name only. Plates were cleared, refilled, barely touched. Voices dropped a register as if volume itself had become a liability. People chose their words the way gamblers chose cards, carefully, with an eye on who might be counting. The star felt it before he admitted it. Authority had shifted, not loudly, not ceremonially, but enough to be noticed. He straightened in his chair, smoothed the front of his jacket, and redirected his attention. "If we're talking about courage," he said, offering a thin smile, "it's easier when your audience doesn't expect depth from you." The remark drifted toward Elvis without ever naming him. Intellectual, polished, the kind of insult that hid behind sophistication. "Music forgives simplicity," the star continued. "Film doesn't. It asks you to disappear inside someone else. Not everyone wants that." A few people glanced at Elvis, waiting. This was the moment they understood. The table had become a test. Marilyn turned slightly, almost instinctively, and spoke before thinking better of it. "He listens," she said. Quiet, personal, more than most. The words weren't a defense. They were a truth. Silence followed, the wrong kind, the dangerous kind. Elvis raised his hand, just enough to stop her. The gesture was subtle, nearly invisible, not dismissal, protection. He didn't look at her when he spoke. He looked at the star. "Disappearing isn't the same as being erased," Elvis said evenly. "Some people confuse the two. No lecture, no edge." The star opened his mouth, then closed it. The exchange had slipped beyond cleverness. There was no advantage left to claim. The host intervened, forced cheer in his voice. "Why don't we move to the sitting room?" he suggested. "Coffee's ready." Chairs scraped back. Relief passed through the group. Motion without resolution. As people stood, Marilyn felt something unfamiliar. Safety, fragile and temporary. She hadn't won anything, but she wasn't alone in it anymore. Elvis stepped back, allowing others to pass. He didn't claim the moment. He let it settle where it would. Behind them, the star remained seated a second longer than necessary, staring at a place on the table where control had slipped through his fingers. The sitting room broke the evening into fragments. Small clusters formed instinctively, people aligning themselves without discussion. Low voices, forced smiles. Everyone pretended to relax while measuring distance, from the tension from each other, from what might still happen. Marilyn stood near the window, one hand resting against the cool glass. The garden outside was dim, orderly, indifferent. She breathed slowly, as if recalibrating. For a moment, she believed the worst had passed. The star approached her with practiced ease. No witnesses close enough to hear. This was intentional. "Rough crowd," he said lightly. "They misunderstand concern when it's dressed too honestly." His tone suggested alliance, not apology. "You should be careful," he added, lowering his voice. "People notice when someone needs defending. It invites interpretations. The implication was surgical. He smiled as if offering advice. Marilyn didn't respond immediately. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, composed, distant, older than she felt. Before she could speak, Elvis's voice entered the space behind them. "I wouldn't finish that thought," he said quietly. The star turned, surprised. He hadn't noticed Elvis nearby. That, too, unsettled him. Elvis didn't raise his voice, didn't step closer. He waited until the man had nothing left to add. "I've seen what happens when stories get written carelessly," Elvis continued. "Careers don't collapse in public. They thin out. Invitations stop. Phones go quiet." The star's jaw tightened. He searched for humor, found none. "This isn't a threat," Elvis said, almost gently. "It's an observation." A door opened behind them. Laughter drifted in from another group, unaware. The moment narrowed, private and sharp. The star forced a nod, straightened his shoulders, and stepped away without another word. Marilyn exhaled, tension leaving her in stages. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't expected it either. Someone entered the room then, pausing mid-step, sensing the residue in the air. "Everything all right?" they asked too quickly. Elvis answered first. "Just talking." And that was true. The hallway outside the sitting room was narrow and dim, lined with framed photographs that documented other people's triumphs. The noise from the party softened there, reduced to a distant murmur. Marilyn leaned against the wall, arms folded loosely, as if holding herself together without admitting she needed to. Elvis stood a few steps away. He didn't crowd her. He understood space. After a moment, she spoke, not looking at him. "You know they'll hate me more now," she said. Not bitter, not accusing, simply precise. Not because of him, because I didn't stay quiet. It wasn't gratitude, it was assessment. Elvis nodded once. "They already decided how to feel," he replied. "Tonight just made it visible." She let out a short breath that might have been a laugh if it had gone on longer. "People think being noticed is the hard part," she said. "They don't talk about what happens after, when everyone thinks they know you well enough to reduce you." She finally turned to him then. Her eyes were clear. Tired, but clear. Elvis didn't rush to fill the silence. "I get talked about like I'm a sound," he said, after a pause. "Not a person. Something loud that happened and should have stayed where it was. No self-pity. Just fact. They don't ask what it costs to keep standing in one place while everyone pulls," he added. Marilyn studied him carefully, as if recalibrating her understanding. Then she shook her head once. "I don't want to disappear tonight," she said. "If I leave now, they'll decide what it meant." That was the decision. Quiet, final. Elvis held her gaze, measuring the weight of it. "Then don't go alone." They walked back toward the sitting room together. No arms linked, no display, just alignment. As Marilyn reached for the door, she paused, fingers resting on the handle. For a fraction of a second, uncertainty flickered, not fear, but awareness. Then she opened it. The room turned toward them instinctively, conversations faltering. The light caught Marilyn's face, steady now, unguarded. Elvis stepped in beside her, unhurried. And in that moment, before a word was spoken, everyone understood something had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. The room didn't greet them. It paused. Conversations thinned out, unfinished sentences dissolving into polite silence. A few people looked up too quickly, then away, as if eye contact itself might imply allegiance. The music from the record player continued, but it felt misplaced now, like decor from an earlier hour. Marilyn crossed the threshold first, not defiantly, simply present. Her posture was straight, her expression unreadable, not armored, not exposed. Elvis followed half a step behind, close enough to matter, far enough to avoid spectacle. No one offered a seat. The star stood near the fireplace, glass untouched in his hand. He nodded once, the gesture empty of warmth. His confidence hadn't vanished, it had curdled into something tighter, more brittle. "Well," he said after a moment, attempting ease, "I hope we didn't lose the mood." The comment floated without a place to land. The host cleared his dazzling throat, forcing a smile. "Elvis was just telling me about his schedule," he said, casually, as if stating a fact of weather. "Busy year ahead." It was a harmless sentence. It did more damage than any insult. Several heads turned toward Elvis with renewed attention, not admiration, not envy, but recalculation. The kind reserved for men whose presence alters plans. The star shifted his weight. "Schedules change," he said lightly, "especially when the public moves on." No one responded. The silence stretched longer than etiquette allowed. 1 second, 2. Someone took a sip of coffee that had long gone cold. Marilyn met the star's eyes. She didn't smile. She didn't look away. Elvis didn't intervene. He didn't need to. The lack of reaction did the work for him. A woman near the sofa excused herself, suddenly remembering an early call time. Another guest checked his watch, muttered about traffic. Departures began quietly, like a tide receding without announcement. The star remained where he was, isolated by absence rather than confrontation. His words no longer summoned agreement. They hovered, unsupported, then fell away. As coats were gathered and goodbyes exchanged, Marilyn felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not triumph, not relief, but clarity. She had not been rescued. She had been witnessed. Elvis stood beside her, expression neutral, already detached from the moment he'd altered. By the time the front door closed behind the last guest, the room felt larger, emptier, and irrevocably changed. Outside, the night had cooled the edges of everything. The driveway lay quiet beneath low amber lights, cars pulling away one by one, tires whispering against gravel. Goodbyes were brief, almost embarrassed, as if everyone sensed they were leaving something unfinished behind them. Marilyn paused near the steps, the faint scent of jasmine drifting from the garden. The house behind her glowed softly, already beginning to seal itself off from what had occurred inside. Hollywood was efficient that way. Memory faded quickly once doors closed. Elvis stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, watching the last set of taillights disappear down the hill. "For a place built on attention," Marilyn said at last, "it's remarkable how invisible people can make you feel." Her voice carried no complaint. It was observational, stripped of performance. "They don't look away because they don't see you," Elvis replied. "They look away because seeing costs them something." She considered that, then nodded. "I used to think if I explained myself better, it would change things," she said. "But explanations only work when someone's listening for truth." A breeze lifted the edge of her coat. She didn't pull it tighter. "I get lonely in rooms full of people," she added, almost as an aside. "Not sad lonely, just unaccompanied." Elvis glanced at her then. "They don't know what to do with someone who keeps standing," he said, "especially after being pushed." She smiled faintly at that, not the smile that belonged to photographs, but a smaller one, reserved and real. They didn't linger. There was no promise exchanged, no sense of continuation demanded, just the quiet acknowledgement of having shared a moment without distortion. Marilyn stepped toward her car, then stopped. "Tonight mattered," she said, not asking for confirmation. Elvis inclined his head once. "It did?" She drove off first, headlights sweeping briefly across his face before vanishing into the curve of the road. Elvis remained a moment longer, alone now. The night absorbed the sounds, the tension, the words left unsaid. By morning, the city would behave as though nothing had happened, but some nights didn't need witnesses to leave their mark. Months passed without ceremony. No headlines traced their origin to that dinner. No interviews hinted at raised voices or wounded pride. Hollywood preferred its consequences to arrive quietly, without attribution. The star continued working, technically. Meetings were postponed, then forgotten. Scripts that once arrived unsolicited now came through assistants, then stopped altogether. No one confronted him. No one needed to. His name still appeared in trade papers, but thinner, lower, less urgent. Invitations softened into polite distance. He never spoke of that night, yet it followed him, not as rumor, but as recalculation. Marilyn moved differently afterward, not defiantly, deliberately. She asked harder questions in meetings, left rooms when conversations turned dismissive. Sometimes she paid for it, sometimes she didn't. She was still underestimated, still boxed in by expectations she hadn't chosen. But silence was no longer automatic. In key moments, she spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, and that alone unsettled people who relied on her compliance. As for Elvis, he never described the evening as anything worth remembering. There was no satisfaction attached to it, no sense of victory. When it crossed his mind, it did so briefly, like a line he'd decided not to cross again. He understood something that night, not about power, but about refusal, about the cost of walking past a moment when silence would be easier. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't caused a scene. He hadn't defended anyone in the way stories preferred. He had simply altered the temperature of a room and let people feel the change. Years later, those who had been there would struggle to explain why that dinner lingered with them. Nothing dramatic had occurred, no argument to quote, no scandal to retell, only the memory of laughter stopping too suddenly and never quite returning. Because after that night in that circle, mockery no longer felt safe. And sometimes that is the only victory history allows.